Hello and welcome to another video. I'm glad you're enjoying them, tuning back in. This video is going to be about personality. Let me pull the show up. We're going to talk about the humanistic perspective, the trait perspective, and the sociocultural perspective. I've already got a whole nother video on Freud and his theory about personality, so you should definitely check that out. First, let's start with a joke. So there's a psychologist who works in an office. He has a receptionist. The receptionist says to him, hey, psychologist, there's somebody here to see you who thinks he's invisible. And the psychologist responds, tell him I can't see him right now. Get it? Because you can't see him. He's busy. You can't see him. Okay. All right, what about personality? So let's see what's going on. First, let's start with the humanistic perspective. There's two main people you need to know with this perspective, and they have some ideas that we need to know as well. So the first person is Abraham Maslow, and he's the guy who came up with the self-actualizing idea. It's the pyramid with physiological needs on the bottom and self-actualizing on the top. Here's the picture of Maslow and Rogers. These guys developed the humanistic perspective in the 1960s. Psychologists up until that point had been dominated by either the Freudian perspective or the behaviorist perspective. So Freud was kind of focused on the unconscious mind and all these dark forces like aggressive and sexual impulses. And behaviorists were focused on external learned behavior like classical conditioning and operant conditioning. So nobody was really looking at your sense of self, your emotions, your goals, your dreams. So that's what the humanistic perspective brings to the table. Here's the self-actualizing pyramid. I'm just realizing that you probably cannot see it down here. The bottom level of the pyramid is physiological needs, then safety, then belonging, then esteem, and the top one is self-actualizing. So that is Abraham Maslow's idea, and that you had to meet these needs. You didn't necessarily have to meet them in order, but the bottom ones most of the time were more important than the top ones. Carl Rogers came up with the idea that people should have unconditional positive regard, which is an attitude of acceptance to others despite their failings. So therapists should have this towards their clients. Parents should have this towards their kids. And it was person-centered. You were focused on the client you were seeing. You weren't focused on your theory and how trying to fit your client into your theory, but you were focused on the person and all of their individual needs. So the humanistic perspective was a nice change. It was refreshing. It had a huge impact on education, on therapists, child rearing, management. The belief that people are basically good and that they can have goals and they can get better was really important. So that's the humanistic perspective. Okay, the trait perspective on personality was that we're born with certain traits and they last throughout our lifetime. And so the goal was to find out which traits really last your whole life as opposed to which traits are just temporary, and trying to identify those. And they identify those, well, before we get to that, so a trait is an individual's unique constellation of durable dispositions and consistent ways of behaving that constitute your personality. So examples of traits would be honest, dependable, moody, impulsive. The way you find out traits is that you use a personality inventory, which is just a long survey of questions. We've done lots of these in class. We did the big 5 personality inventory, and we found out our personality traits on the big 5. So that's how you find out the traits. So that's very different from doing therapy like Freud or the humanistic perspective that's doing counseling. It's just a multiple choice test. The most famous one, the most widely used, is the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. I've taken this a couple times, and it's a long test. It's very thorough. Originally developed to help identify psychological disorders. The MMPI was empirically derived, which means empirically derived is a term you should remember. It means that they gave lots of questions when they were originally making this test, and then they find out using all kinds of statistical analysis which questions are most important. So which questions show that someone is an introvert, which questions show that someone's stable, and then they find that out and then they make the test. So it's kind of a trial and error almost. Speaking of the big five, psychologists have kind of settled on 5 main traits that last throughout your lifetime. And they're right here. You can remember this word canoe. Canoe stands for conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, openness, and extroversion. And you can see in this chart, you could either be organized or disorganized, careful or careless, disciplined or impulsive. So those are the things that make up conscientiousness, and you can see what they all are here. That's the test we took in class way back in the fall. With the big 5, people kind of wonder some things, like are these traits supposed to be stable? And they have found out doing lots of longitudinal studies that they are quite stable in adulthood. They change some when you're younger. People ask, are these inherited? And they think that it's about 50% heritable, meaning in your genes, that you get them from your parents. And people ask, what about other cultures? Do they have these same 5 traits that are kind of there? And yes, they are consistent across cultures. So there's one problem with the trait perspective, and that is the person-situation controversy. People will acknowledge that there are these traits and that they are enduring, but behavior for individuals is different in different situations. Therefore, traits are not good predictors of behavior. So you might have the traits, but they don't predict your behavior because in different situations you behave differently. For instance, let's say you have a job and you're an introvert. Maybe you're mostly quiet and kind of keep yourself at your job, but then when the other coworker that you really like, who's your really good friend, shows up, maybe you're really outgoing in those situations. So traits don't necessarily predict behavior, so that might be a problem. Okay, the last perspective we're going to look at is the social cultural perspective. These guys think that behavior emerges from an interplay of external and internal influences. So internal influences on this chart would be the biological influences, your genetics, your brain activity, your nervous system. Your psychological influences, your learned responses through operant conditioning, your unconscious thoughts, like Freud said, and then your social cultural perspectives, your childhood experiences, the influence of the given situation, like I just said, when you're at work and your friend shows up, your cultural expectations, what do people think of you, what's the norm in your society, and the social support you have. Do you have family supporting you, friends supporting you, etc.? So the idea of personal control is important to the social cultural perspective. There's this idea that you can have a sense of control within yourself, that you are in control, or you can have a sense that control is somewhere outside of you, that you don't have control over your life. There are other factors influencing you that are bigger than you. So if you think it's outside, it's called an external locus of control. The perception that chance or outside forces beyond our personal control determine our fate. So people who would have this perspective might be people who are growing up in poverty. Maybe they lose their job. Maybe they fail out of school. Maybe there's a lot of violence, but it's all stuff around them that they don't have control over that impacts their life a lot. An internal locus of control refers to the perception that we control our own fate. And so if you have an internal locus of control, that's usually seen as a better thing because you're going to maybe have higher self-esteem and take more actions to improve your life and solve problems in your life. So with this idea, a related idea is the idea of learned helplessness. When you're unable to avoid repeated adverse events, it's bad things happening to you, animals and humans can learn to be helpless. So if you have uncontrollable bad events over and over again, you sense a lack of control over your life, and then you exhibit sort of this helpless attitude, helpless behavior. There's a famous experiment they did with dogs on this subject, where some dogs were shocked and some could escape, but the ones who were shocked and could not escape learned to be helpless. One of the final things we're going to talk about in this video is positive psychology. Humanistic psychology is a part of that. And positive psychology is the attempt to improve human lives by helping people become more fulfilled and improve their well-being, their character, and their social groups. So it's an emphasis on the positive. Instead of looking at the DSM manual and all the disorders, these guys are going to look positive and say what's going right and how do we improve people. So it's more of a focus on that. Whoops, wrong direction. Okay, so what do people say about the social cognitive perspective? They say it has a positive effect, that it makes psychologists aware of the effects situations have on people. Critics of the social cognitive perspective pay a lot of say that the social cognitive perspective is paying too much attention to the situation, less attention to the individual, his unconscious mind, emotions, and genetics. So there's some pros and cons about the social cognitive perspective. Okay, finally, here's a couple of final terms we should know. Reciprocal determinism, the interacting influence between personality and environmental factors. So, and self-esteem, one's feeling of self-worth. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up there because this is getting kind of long. So if you have any questions about any of those theories of personality, let me know in class. Thanks for watching.